281, Readings. Part 12. Healing hands. Most of the healing suggestions brought forth by the readings are in regards to Christ vibrations being transferred to another by the use of both hands. Please keep in mind that some may include massage, chiro, physio, etc. When one is able to so raise within themselves such vibrations as to pass through the whole course of the attributes of physical attunements to the disseminating force or center or the eye, then the body of that individual becomes a magnet that may, if properly used, bring healing to others with the laying on of hands. This is the manner in which such a healing becomes effective by the laying on of hands. The body may raise itself to those influences where the healing may come even as spoken or laying on of hands. There are those that need the body vibrations each day, that these may be made whole by the laying on of hands, which will require some 2, 3 to 4 weeks, that will bring an understanding and a change in the body or bodies that will make for wholeness of purpose. The manner of overcoming such may best be accomplished with a laying on of hands that enables the individual, the entity so being aided, to have something to hold on to that is as concrete as that it is battling with. Then, as is seen in the more concerted action of the group, in their cooperative concerted action, and with the continued laying on of hands, there will come as we find a complete cure. Please give instructions as to the way in which we may heal 1784. Are these attacks epileptic? If so, what type? These, as we find, are of the colonic type. 1. Preferably one close kin to the body of opposite sex may use the same character of laying on of hands with the affirmation that there is being created that within the physical being that will have such Christ consciousness as to eradicate all disorder. These would require, to be sure, the laying on of the hand. The right hand over the solar plexus center and the spine, or 9th and 10th dorsal, and the left hand over the cecum and the transverse colon area. Thy healing be according to thy faith. To another, thy faith hath made thee whole. To another, with the laying on of hands, was said, according to thy faith, so be it unto you. These things consider in thy meditation, and thy prayer. Should I become a healer? If so, what method should I use? There are many various channels through which healing may come. That as of the individual contact. That as of the faith. That as of the laying on of hands. That as will create in the mind, for it is the builder in a human being, that consciousness that makes for the closer contact with the universal or the creative forces in its experience. That which is nearest akin to that concept built. Use that thou hast, then, in hand. Just how should we present the healing group work along with the study groups now being formed? The spirituality will arouse that interest that makes the consciousness of such work in a group that would be of greater aid where the spirit quickens. Will seek, as the channels are opened, tenets and lessons that may be made by those who have experienced in themselves that necessity and vital force quickened to instruct or direct or to aid ones in finding their abilities in such directions. To some it is given by the laying on of hands. To others in the spoken word. To others in the silence of meditation and prayer. To others in the alleviating, through their coordinating of all forces within, the physical disturbances as related to the mental, material and spiritual forces within a body. The quickening may come from without. The healing must be from within. Would we heal others, we must first heal ourselves. When the subject of the laying on of hands for healing was brought up, it was thought better to tell this group things to do, rather than not to do, when the danger of such a method without proper precautions was pointed out, also, that we could pass on only that which we had found helpful. Rather, stress the raising of the Christ consciousness in each one, and the various methods and problems will take care of themselves. The physical body is made up of elements that keep the body in its motion necessary for sustaining its equilibrium. If in the atomic forces there becomes an overbalancing, an injury, a happening, an accident, there are certain atomic forces destroyed or others increased. Then, in meeting these, it becomes necessary for the creating of that influence within each individual body to bring a balance. How, then, does the activity of any influence act upon the individual system for bringing healing in the consciousness to become conscious of its desire? When a body has so attuned or raised its own vibration sufficiently, it may by the motion of the spoken word awaken the activity of the emotions to such an extent as to revivify, resuscitate or to change the rotary force or the atomic forces in the activity of the structural portion or the vitali forces of a body in such a way and manner as to set it again in motion. Thus does spiritual or psychic influence of body upon body bring healing to any individual, whether by the laying on of hands, prayer, by a look, by the application of any mechanical influence, or any of those forces in materia medica, bring resuscitating or healing. The law, then, is compliance with the universal spiritual influence. In the study of his application of healing, in his ministry, we're all healed only by the spoken word. We're all healed by the laying on of hands. We're all healed by any one way or manner. Rather, as ye analyze his activities, and that which is thy own experience, ye may see the manifestation of the truth that the Lord is one, exemplified in the healing as well as in the daily relationships of man to man in all phases of his experience. Thus this group, as ye analyze and study spiritual healing, be consistent in thy activities and in thy thoughts, and in thy purposes, in thy hopes and in thy desires day by day. And in the application of those truths in thy relationships to thy fellows. Be persistent as well as consistent. Thus there may come indeed into the experience of all the more and more awareness of his consciousness, of the spirit of truth, as a living thing in thy experience. Healing by laying of hands found in other readings. Make thy heart, thy mind, thy body, one with him, and ye may by the laying on of hands, by the counseling with those that be weak in body, disturbed in the mind be a channel through which the message of the Master may come. Before that we find the entity was in the land now known as the Persian, during those periods when there was the activity for the healing of those by the laying on of hands, by the purifying of the body by the purgings from disorder and distress, by the means of those that in the present are called cleanliness. The entity in the present may bring the joy and peace to many, even by the laying on of hands, and seeking in prayer the throne of grace, that is sufficient to all who will unburden their souls. Desirous of seeing, experiencing, being in contact with individuals who had actually seen and heard the words of the Master. Desirous of meeting those who had been healed by the laying on of hands or by merely the words spoken. Desirous of hearing those who had eaten of bread created by the word of that teacher. Give thanks to him who is all the healing that can be, whether only the power of suggestion is used, the laying on of hands, the administering of any of the elements to supply a physical balance, or what not. Can I develop spiritual healing or psychic powers? Can develop healing by the laying on of hands or of magnetic vibrations? These would be well, but get the physical body better first. Let thy light ever so shine that others with whom ye speak may take cognizance of the fact that ye have walked with him. If I have the power of healing, in what form will it express itself? By the laying on of hands, when the body itself has been purified by the healing within its own self, and the vibrations raised to that where the aura or vibratory force of self may accord or attune itself immediately with the vibrations of other individuals seeking aid. The entity made for the abilities in the applications of the material forces in nature for the healing of the body, the applications of clay, oils, drugs, waters, and the quieting from within, through the laying on of hands. There are the needs for the purging of body, of mind, so that through the mind and the laying on of hands the entity may bring to others that of health, hope and understanding. As oft as practical have the prayer and the laying on of hands. This should be through the ninth dorsal and the frontal portion of head. Do not trouble their minds, but keep the Christ consciousness. All healing comes through spiritual forces. The abilities that have grown with this entity through experiences in the earth, of the laying on of hands to bring quietness, the answering as of face to face in water, as in my spirit beareth witness with thy spirit. For all healing is of a spiritual nature, whether it is the application from mechanical means, medicinal, suggestive, or the laying on of hands. Edgar Cayce's reply. I believe that you will find in the laying on of hands for 275, Mrs. 255, that if you place the left hand on the hip and the right hand on the lower part of the spinal column just where it joins the pelvis, just hold for 20 to 30 minutes each day, you will be surprised at the results you will get. This is the same thing as the low electrical vibration that 275 had from the battery, though is much more effective, to be sure, when it is body electricity that is passed from one to another, or magnetic influence, which is not unscientific at all. In the present we will find abilities in those directions of the healing arts, especially where there is the application of mechanotherapy, or mechanical appliances as combined with the laying on of hands, or adjustments, or things as would pertain to direct contact with the physical body of other. Have I any healing power? What power hasn't the body, with that faith, with that understanding? These may be used in many directions by the laying on of hands, and with prayer. Anointing as of oil. Anointing with oil. Pouring in of those of the Spirit, that knowledge, of understanding, will bring blessings to many. Do not neglect that that has been committed into thy keeping. Thine own. For there will gradually come the growth of the abilities within the entity's experience, to not only bring messages of hope and of light to others, but to bring aid. Through the very laying on of hands. To those who are not only mentally but physically sick. To those who are ill at ease, rather than the diseased, throughout the entity's experience. In such a manner, with that tempering, with that training which has been indicated, may the entity be of the greater service. Before that we find the entity was in the Gobi land. The entity was active in aiding those from the Egyptian land to establish a hospital, or an institution for the care of the physical and the mental complete. In those the entity aided, and there the entity developed and made for those innate forces and powers that are as hidden. Hence the entity will find the abilities. Though the entity may be unaware of same in the present, though at times there has been the experience. To the laying on of hands heal those of headaches, or of those inclinations, or to remove blemishes from the body physical. If there is but the mental concentration of self in these directions. All forces in the material plane are manifestations of the unseen plane, or the evolutions of life are as the evolutions of the spiritual life. These are but manifestations of the one spirit. And self, kept in that way that brings to thine understanding the varied conditions as are presented, only aids self in the greater development in each and every phase of understanding. And as the bodily efforts in the mental man become the pictures of those elements that make up the inner man, so will the various manifestations enable the self to expand in the various fields, a man well-rounded in the material side, but able, capable, and with an understanding heart and purpose teach, manifest, those very powers, by the laying on of hands, or by the speaking of the word. Know this, that all healing of every nature must come from a mental attitude created by either that activity within the system as food, as medicine, as activities, the principle of which is constructive in aiding those deficient portions to become coordinate with the rest of the system for constructive forces. Whether this is taken internally, mechanically applied, laying on of hands, or by the spoken word, the effect must be the same, but each in its sphere of activity. Do not judge, then, mental things only by material reaction or activity, nor judge spiritual things except as the patterns or reflections of those things in a material world. Before that we find the entity was in the land now called the Persian or Arabian. The entity was among the natives that came with the first of the caravans that made for those activities where it became a place of healing. The entity became a healer. Hence blue-green has been as a color, as a vibration. Also many bangles, many fancy things become as an innate portion of the entity's whole feeling, many wavy lines, music that is of a particular nature or kind. And all of these raise the vibrations of the entity. And the entity may be, if it will apply itself, a healer to others, even by the laying on of hands. For the vibrations are high, and these are of the healing nature to those especially who are troubled with those things that have raised the emotions to detrimental influences to the whole of the assimilation, the assimilating system, to the nervous system, to the heart's activity, to the influences where destruction of self is at times felt necessary. The entity may soothe, the entity may cause all such to become quiet. Here, for this body there are disturbances in the lymph circulation, especially in the soft tissue of face and head. The antrum, the frontal and the inner area has shown infection, from the congestion and a general catarrhal condition. These arise from many sources, but from long standing have begun to be of a constitutional nature. This does not imply, then, that these are incurable. But, as is the influence in all healing, whether the administration be purely suggestive, of a vibratory nature, from the laying on of hands, or by the spoken word, the administration of medicinal properties, or even the use of means to remove diseased tissue, we find that the same source of individuality in the cause must be attained. That is, that which has been dissenting in its nature through the physical forces of the body, must be so attuned to spiritual forces in itself as to become revitalized. The summit is given to be exhorters, to others teachers, to others healers by laying on of hands, others healers by prayer, to one the interpreting of tongues, to another the speech by tongues. But all of the same Spirit, the consciousness of the Christ abiding within self. Not only by acclaim, but by practical application of the Christ Spirit in thy daily walks, thy daily talks, and thy dealings with thy fellow man. Let him that approacheth then the throne of service do so rather in that attitude, that may be expressed in this. In thine own words. Here am I, O God. Use thou me in the manner, in the channels, in the ways, that I may the better, through the love thou hast shown me in the gift of the promises in the Christ, glorify thee before my fellow man. As the body understands, we have a body physical, we have a body mental, we have a body spiritual. They are one, yet each has its attributes that function either separately or coordinately. The active force in all of these is of the spiritual nature, but release same within each sphere, so that the spiritual forces may function. Not so much by the use of drugs, but rather those stimulations as indicated that may only aid the impulse for the activity of the creative energies and forces through the system. All healing is one, whether in the laying on of hands, by word of mouth, by mechanotherapy, mechanical applications or whatnot. God is the creative force that gives life. And not the medicine or the application. Uranus brings the extremes, interest in the occult, the abilities to heal even by the laying on of hands, those who are closely associated with the body. As the entity experiences with those of the closer association, the ability to touch or to be near or to put the hands or to have the hands of the body put on them, brings quiet, brings a peace, brings a satisfaction. This is good, applied from the spiritual angle, and the ways in the mental for healing. But it may become of a different spirit of activity if applied in only the material satisfaction that may be gained. Before that the entity was in the Egyptian land during those periods of reconstruction when the turmoils had arisen from not only the rebellions within, but from the Atlanteans' attempt to set up portions of their activities. The entity was among those being purified in the temple of sacrifice, who became fearful of the sacrifices and the consequences of the activities of the Atlantean teachers. Thus coming under fear, great disturbances were brought to the entity. Tekel, yet with the reassurance from the activities of the priest, through the actions in the temple beautiful, great were those abilities of the entity in the healing arts, the laying on of hands, through the very vibrations and abilities which the entity gained in that experience. In the present the entity may find a greater service, a greater outlet for self's ideals, self's purposes, in studying and applying much of that, as may be gained through such activity again. Should faith healing be included in the teachings of theology? If so, who is best qualified to teach it? Those in the orthodox manner, those who should, through faith, laying on of hands, anointing with oil, praying over same. There is innate in each individual that may be awakened to those abilities in their activity. Are they willing to attune themselves to the laws as pertain to the active forces in self's own experience, keeping self unspotted and clean from the world, and keeping that brings according in the body that necessary for its awakening to its own spiritual activity? Who shall do such? Such as are called in their own experience. Knowing that as has been given, to some is given teaching, to others healing, to others ministry, to others on the various forces, as are attributes of his love, his force, in a material world. One that is so given, then, let them sanctify theirselves, their bodies, their minds, to his fellow man's service, for he that lendeth to the Lord covers a multitude of sins. It is true then that the mind may heal entirely by the spoken word, by the laying on of hands, dependent upon the consciousness of the motivative forces in the individual body. Yet those requiring material expression to create a balance may necessitate drug, knife, water, heat, electricity, or any of those forces that are yet what? What is the spirit? The manifestation of God. The creative force working in, with and upon what? The awareness, the interconsciousness of the body, the mind, the spirit, as separated in individuals. In Jupiter, both a benevolent and a questioned influence arises. Thus the universality of the entity's activities, of the entity's abilities, of the entity's virtues. These become influences in the mental forces, the mental abilities, yet. Through these very Jupiterian and Venus influences, we find that the entity has attained the abilities to mentally and physically aid those who are in need of that, to quiet the fears, to make rational that which arises from fear in the experience of others. Thus the entity is given the ability as a healer, even through the laying on of hands, for those needing such as has been indicated. As to the abilities of the entity in the present and that to which it may attain, and how. In two fields there may be advancements. The one, in the study pertaining to faith healing. Or the raising of vibrations in individuals through the activity of those forces by the laying on of hands. The other, through the mental and commercial field that would have to do with either associations in the field of politics, yet in the diplomatic, or in the consulate association, being the better. In the one before this we find in that land, that experience known as the Persian or Arabian land. The entity became one of a musician of fame, even in this plane. In the development the entity applied those tenets that were given in that period to music, that it brought from the planes to those surroundings, that of the joy in service of one to another, becoming a healer in the latter experience through the laying on of hands, in song and in the chants as were made by the entity and its associates. In the present, with those directing influences, may the entity. In those of stringed instruments. Bring again those of the shepherd's song, again those of the mountain song, in rain, in sunshine, in the various activities in nature. Hence those directing influences will bring that awakening that will bring joy, harmony, peace, loving understanding, to self and many. Before that was in the Egyptian land during those periods when there were the preparations for the activities from the temple beautiful, and especially in association with those that held for the establishing of homes as individual units. The entity was close in activity with the priest, as well as with many of those that held to that phase of man's unfoldment during those periods of activity there. Here again we find the abilities in the entity as the decorator of the home, as to the preparing of wearing apparel. As a purchasing agent, as a designer and such, the entity might easily apply self in the present. Do not forget thy abilities to heal by the laying on of hands. The name then was Ard Elam. How may I use spiritual forces for improving or ridding diseased conditions of the body? If used in self, it is by application of the tenets of spiritual truths to others. If used for others, it may be done by tenets and by the laying on of hands in the manner attempting to produce or carry vibrations through the body. Though the body forces are low at times, if the radioactive appliance is used daily, there will be plenty of strength in the magnetic forces that may be made to pass through the body, through the area where there is congestion or any form of such physical disturbance. Before that the entity was in the Holy Land during those periods when healings were being attempted and practiced by the disciples or apostles, during and after the activities of the Master in the earth. The entity was among those of the household of the jailer whom Paul aided when he was released from prison. Following the experience, the entity then, as the wife of the jailer, made profession of the faith and became active as a healer. Hence the entity will find in itself today, if there is the renewing of the spiritual influences from within, the laying on of hands or the magnetic treatment will be very effective under the hands of this entity. The name then was Julia. Know that life in its manifestation is of that force called electrical, and in its vibrations as of positive and negative forces. In even the atoms or cells of the body is builded by that which influences and, as has been shown, as of its own hereditary influence, by the active forces upon the vitamin forces. Hence, when any necessary force is needed for creating this balance that may through emotion, through contact, through infection or the like at times become overactive or submerged in the numbers of the active forces between the positive and negative influences, it may be supplied by maintaining that balance through the lowest form of electrical vibration that may be created in the body. And 2. Self may store within self's own body that which is natural and healing influence to others by laying on of hands and by the stimulation of those vibrations necessary as may pass through any particular portion of another body that needs the creating of balance in that physical body. Before that we find the entity was in the Holy Land when there were those teachers who were following in the footsteps of the Son of Man, even one Jesus of Nazareth. The entity was one who in the period was used by others to interpret for men seeking material gain, who were rebuked by Peter. Thus the entity was healed from the body being used by other influences outside of self for gain. Thus the entity was purified for a purpose and became one who supplied in the laying on of hands, healing forces to others. Keep away from thy interpretations, then, that it would tend to be of prophecy, but rather that which brings mental and physical healing, because of the deep purpose within thy soul. The name then, as would be called in the present, was Elon. In what manner may these souls, as one, find then expression in bringing to those that are troubled in body, in mind? They have their individual methods or manners of approach. To one it is innate and finds expression by the laying on of hands, by holding within self the abilities for the replenishing, the quickening of life itself in the very activity, by the means of subjugation of those influences in and about others. To the other it is an activative force, one reaching or gaining its access through its spiritual development and spiritual import, yet means not only by implication, but by the applying of that which may be termed as the use of energies in nature itself. That is the handmaid to every individual that not only dedicates itself, but that makes application within its experience of the glories that the Lord hath poured into the minds and hearts of the children of men, that they may know. Then unifying these, let both in their own method, in their own manner apply same, yet knowing deep within self, that the source of power, the source of might, the source of grace, the source of mercy, the source of life, the source of health, comes only from the living God. Lose self more and more in the Christ consciousness, if you would gain in those activities as may be thine, as may be seen by the soul development of this entity. To each there is given the influence or spirit of direction. To some there is given the interpretation of tongues, or the interpretation of words or signs or symbols. This is what is meant by interpreters of tongues in the Holy Writ. To some is given healing, to some is given exhortation, to some is given ministration, to some is given one thing, some another. Or, the attunement is the clarifier, or that which makes for clearer accord with that phase of the phenomena called clairvoyance, telepathy, or any psychic force of an entity. In this particular body, we will find any of these, but the most will be given in healing, by the laying on of hands. Before that, then, we find the entity was in what is now known as the Persian and Arabian land. The entity came as one weakened body, for the healing influences of that teacher in the experience. And as the body became strong, there came the ever desire, that there might be given the power, to self for the aid to those in her own land. For the entity then was among the princesses in that land, the entity brought to its own peoples then, that gained by the understanding of the raising within self of the spirit of truth, that quickens the flesh, that quickens matter, so that it becomes constructive, and not derogatory to those influences of force in the atoms of the body. Hence we find in the present experience the abilities for the laying on of hands, for the raising along the cells within the individual body from the storehouse to the disseminating drawn in the upper portion of the temple for bringing strength to the fellow man. Let this ever be not as of body strength, but of the spirit making alive in and through thee of that divine within thy fellow man. For only in raising, that knowledge may the permanency of aid be made, for of thyself ye may do nothing, save as the Son, the Father, worketh in and through thee, for thy known knowledge, thy known understanding, that ye may be one with him. If the entity will enter into the silence with the divine influences thrown about self, that there may be no hindrances from outside influences that would possess or would direct, other than from that promise in him, as ye ask in my name, believing, so shall it be in thine experience, there may be the purification of self. As the entity surrounds self with that which is innately an expression of purification, of dedication, of making for an at-oneness with the purposes in creative forces and energies. Such that there may flow in and through and out to others, that which has been the promise, that the laying on of hands, and the prayers of those that have found patience, may save many from the turmoils and strifes of a disease in a material body. Mercury with Neptune has brought the healing influences in the experience. And during those years of vision, if the entity had grasped, as it were, with even those harsh things being said by others, the abilities for the greater healing might have been in the experience for years in this sojourn. Yet in the present, if the entity holds to those promises that have been made, there may be brought in the experience during this year. And especially in this particular year, and for a period to come. The greater abilities for not only the laying on of hands but the abilities to analyze, to give to others much that to them may be as mysterious, yet will make for the awareness in their experience of the greater forces of the infinite, working in and through the children of men. As I have for some time been leading the worship service in the junior department at Methodist Church, and also teaching in the same department, which of the two should I accept this fall? Or should I give up both of them and devote all my time to the Glad Helpers work? Please advise. Do not give up the work in association with the church. As we find, that which leads in the worship, rather than the teaching, would be that to hold fast to. For as thou hast through all the experiences led in the worship or in the expressions of worship, this fits thee rather to keep that which marries much in the experiences of others. As the Glad Helpers work, this, to be sure, will become more and more a portion of self, in the ability, by the laying on of hands, by being present with them, to bring to others a quicker response, or precipitating strength through those knowledges, those understandings, those livings of the self in the light. Keep all of this.